This past Sunday, we celebrated the Transfiguration of Christ. Now, the summary of this story is that Christ goes up on the mountain, and he brings Peter, James, and John with him, and he reveals his glory to these disciples. He does this, his face shines, and his clothes are as white as lightning, or whiter than any launderer could ever bleach them. And at the same time, Moses and Elijah are there talking with each other, talking to Jesus about his impending crucifixion. Peter starts to say something stupid, and God the Father interrupts him. Peter is saying, "Hey, we should build tents for you guys." Bold move, Peter, but missing the point. Kudos for the initiative, but God has something else better in mind. And God the Father speaks out of the cloud, says, "This is my son whom I love, and him I am well pleased. Listen to him." This is very similar to the account of Jesus' baptism by John the Baptizer man. And the disciples, they fall to the ground, and Jesus basically says, "Do not be afraid," when they lift their heads up. Moses and Elijah are gone, and they walk down the mountain, and Jesus tells them not to tell anybody. So that's the summary of the Transfiguration. Jesus was transfigured before them. His appearance changed before them. The glory of God was revealed to them. Okay, so that's all well and good. Jesus demonstrating that he's God between his own demonstration and between the words of the Father. But what is the deal with Moses and Elijah? What are they doing there? Why was it necessary that they were there, and that the writers of the gospel accounts included talking about them being there? Well, let's get into it. There are differences in the different gospel accounts. For example, in Matthew, this event is talked about 6 days after Jesus' previous statement. And in, I believe it's Luke, I think it says about 8 days, which 6 days is about 8 days. Is there a reason for these numbers? Maybe, maybe not. But there are also other details that are described differently, like the whiteness, the lightning-like quality of Jesus' garments is described as slightly different fashion. And one thing in particular that is found only in the Gospel of Luke, if I remember, is the Gospel account, according to Luke, is the subject of Elijah and Moses' discussion. They're talking about the Exodus, or the going out, or the death of Jesus. Now, this is important because it helps us to understand a little bit why they were there. Now, one thing the Bible doesn't explicitly say is, and Moses and Elijah were here, and this is exactly why they were here, and this is all the answers to all the questions that you have in your head about this entire event. That doesn't happen. This is just one of those times where God tells us an event happened and doesn't explain the entire thing to us. So why were Moses and Elijah there? Well, the Bible doesn't explicitly say, but there are some fairly good answers. I think one of the answers that I've always liked is that Moses and Elijah were there as representation of the law and the prophets. Now, if you recall, the law and the prophets, this was a term that was used to refer to the entirety of the Old Testament. Think about Moses as a representation of the law. Not only did Moses receive the Ten Commandments, the 10 sayings, but Moses is also responsible for the Pentateuch, for penning down the first 5 books of the law, of the Torah. And then a lot of times, the phrase "the law and the prophets." Okay, well, and the other half is the prophets. There's also wisdom literature in the middle, like Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, that sort of thing. But basically, if you say the law and the prophets, that means the Old Testament's entirety. But the question is, and why Elijah? Why would Elijah be chosen to be a representation of the prophets? I mean, first one that comes to my mind is Isaiah. He certainly wrote a lot, and he was a prophet. But Elijah definitely did a lot, and he was also a prophet. In fact, his story was so special that he is one of the few people who has been on this earth and not died. He was carried up into heaven in a fiery chariot, if you recall, the presence of Elisha. So it definitely fits that Elijah, maybe instead of or as well as Isaiah, could be chosen as a representation of the prophets. So what you have here is you have the law and the prophets speaking about the impending death of Christ. Or, to phrase it another way, you have the Old Testament talking about the life and death of Christ. And that's exactly what the Old Testament does, is it lays out the necessity that we have for forgiveness, for salvation. This is, going all the way back to the beginning when Adam and Eve sinned and they're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. You have the law that basically says, okay, well, wages of sin is death. You sin, guess what? That means you need to die. But then you also have promises. Now you go all the way back to Genesis 3:15, the proto-evangelion. You have the first gospel. You have the first promise of good news. And that's what prophecy is, if you think about it. Prophecy is a promise for the future, a telling of the future. Now, prophecy sometimes talked about bad stuff that would happen in the future. But at the same time, you don't get any good news from the law. You don't get any good news from follow this or you will die. Oh, you've already failed at following it, so you're going to die. That's not good news. Prophecy is the only place that you could possibly find the gospel. Which is why I thought it was interesting that not only is the presence of Moses and Elijah, not only are they pictures of the law and the prophets, the two physical sections of the Old Testament, but they're also a picture of the law and the gospel, the commands of God and the promises of God. So I went back and I started looking at the text surrounding these things, because one of the Old Testament texts that we have that we went over is Moses is coming down from the mountain. Now, actually, he goes up and comes down from the mountain, and as he does so, his face is radiating with the glory of God. He's in the presence of God for a prolonged period of time, and when he comes down from the mountain, his face is shining. His face is shining from being in the presence of God. So he veils his face. And it doesn't explicitly say why he veils his face, but it talks about, well, the Israelites, we know that they were terrified, they were trembling with this entire encounter with God. You go back to Exodus chapters 19 and 20. This is Moses he's getting the Ten Commandments from God. And before he does so, the people look up to the mountain and they see the presence of God, or evidence of the presence of God. They see fire, and there's like a loud trumpet blast, and there's a whole chaotic cacophony, and they are terrified. It says that they tremble in Exodus 19 and Exodus 20. Both of these places it talks about the Israelites at the foot of the mountain. It says that they're trembling, they're scared. And Moses actually says, you know what? God is here, and it's right that you're afraid, because by being afraid at the presence of God, this may prevent you from sinning. And that's true. That's one of the purposes of the law, is that the curb of the law is, that if you break this law, then a horrible punishment awaits you, and that can actually deter people from breaking the law. Shocker, punishing people for crimes deters them from committing crimes. I don't know, it's rocket science right there. But so yeah, they're terrified. They hear this all this loud noise and fire on top of the mountain, and then they're terrified. They say, Moses, go up. We're not going to talk to God. If we talk to God, then we're going to die. And Moses is like, you're right to be afraid. And he comes down with the Ten Commandments and all these laws and commands and stuff from God. So okay. And then, of course, as he's talking with God, it absorbs the glory of God, and it shines off of his face. So he goes down and he puts a veil on. He veils himself in front of the Israelites. Well, I was thinking, what's the connection with Elijah? Does Elijah have any connection to this story? This going into a mountain, veiling, fire of God. And then I remembered there was the account of Elijah after the prophets of Baal, the instance from the prophets of Baal. So he goes, and you remember the story. He basically spends the whole day taunting these prophets of Baal and saying, why don't you, maybe your God's asleep or whatever. Maybe he's journeying or on the toilet or whatever. And then he calls down fire from heaven, and God delivers the fire. And everybody knows then that there is only one true God, and the prophets of Baal are put to death. Well, Jezebel is not happy with this, and she wants to kill Elijah. And Elijah, in fear of his life, runs away. Literally, he runs off. And he comes to a cave. And he goes to hide in this cave. And then God comes and talks to him. And while he's in this cave, he tries to figure out the presence of God. Things start happening outside the cave. Things start happening on the mount, or at the mount, it says. There's a fire, and there's a strong wind, and the mountains are broken. The mountain is broken apart. And there's all this loud noise and cacophony, just like there may have been at Mount Sinai. But it says God is not in the fire, or in the wind, or in the earthquake. And then there's a low whisper, a low voice. God is in that whisper. So what does Elijah do? He wraps his face and goes out to be in the presence of God. There's a lot of similarities in this. It's almost a mirror image. Moses descends from the mountain. He doesn't wear a veil in the presence of God, but he wears a veil in the presence of the people. The people are brought fear and terror. That's the law. Elijah has fear and terror already when he comes to this place, and he wraps his face to come and address the Lord. And the Lord gives him a promise. So he promises basically to protect the lineage of the prophets. He says, you'll appoint Elisha, and anyone who his sword escapes will be killed by, whoever the next dude is. And it's a prophet. It's a promise, a prophecy of comfort that Elijah receives. So Moses gets the law, Elijah gets the gospel, and they're both here on the mountain with Jesus. And Jesus is the fulfillment of both the law and the gospel, because you think about it, the law is the requirement to do all these things, and that the wages of sin is death. And guess what Jesus does? He dies. He not only lives a perfect sinless life, but he also pays the penalty for death. Jesus is the fulfillment of Moses. And in fact, the veil of Moses, I would say, is removed. It's torn in two when Jesus dies on the cross. When sin is paid for on the cross, that veil of separation between the glory of God and man is removed. It's destroyed. And in the case of Elijah, the veil of Elijah is removed on Easter morning in the resurrection. Jesus gets out of the tomb, and what does he leave behind in the tomb but the burial shroud, the veil that covered his face as he lay in the tomb? Because while the veil of Moses is destroyed in the fulfillment of the law, the veil of Elijah is removed. The separation from the glory of God is removed with the deliverance of the gospel, with Jesus raising from the dead as the firstborn from among the dead, just as the rest of you Christians will raise from the dead in body and soul. It's interesting, it's this language of veils, veiling the glory of God. And it's all about Jesus. Full Transfiguration. Shocker that the gospel account of Jesus on the mountain displaying his glory is all about Jesus. Everything is about it. The God the Father speaking out of heaven, "This is my son whom I love, listen to him." The glory shining off of his face, and even the presence of Moses and Elijah, it's all to point to Jesus, who is the fulfillment of the law and the gospel, the fulfillment of the law and the prophet. It's a pretty cool story. I think I could get at least 100 more sermons out of the Transfiguration text. I hope you had fun. I hope you had a good week. God bless and take care.